Hi. So in this module, we're going to go through backend hosting components and tools. So I'm logged into, there are a couple of main areas that I would like to highlight that you'll have access to, and not just SiteGround, but other hosting environments as well. A lot of developers and people that are new to building websites have issues with this. So I wanted to, or have a lot of questions, I should say. So I wanted to cover some of the main components that are, again, going to look a little bit different in SiteGround, but will be the same concepts and the same type of features that you'll get with other hosting environments as well. One of the things that I wanted to do initially was change the URL, so point to the actual domain name that I'm going to be using for this project to this website. If you remember a couple of modules ago when I was creating the website, I selected the option to have a temporary domain assigned. So that's why the address right now is this temporary address. There were three options at the time that I could have selected. I could select this temporary option. I could have selected hooking up an external domain, meaning a domain that is hosted somewhere else with another provider, for example, which is very common, or a domain that I own already through SiteGround. So that's also an option. SiteGround does sell domains. Some hosting providers don't. So those were the three options. What I'll do for the purposes of this training, which is kind of a common scenario, is I'm going to hook up a domain that's purchased on another provider to this particular project. So I'll show you how to do that in this video. That's probably the hardest way to do it, and that's why I wanted to showcase it. If you already own the domain with the current provider, so if I owned the domain with SiteGround, it would be much easier. So this is probably a harder way to do it. So if in SiteGround, the way you do that is you can do it two ways. You can point your current domain or the domain that you want to use using name servers, or you can point what's called your A record in your DNS settings to the IP of this particular project. I'm going to use the name server route, and then I'll show you how to edit that and modify it in SiteGround and how to work with that option. So I'll click on Manage. And when I click on Manage, I'll get a few options here. In SiteGround, what you need to do here is click on these three little buttons and go change primary domain. So this might look a little bit different than in another hosting environment, for example, but most of the time you'll be able to change the domain if you're not using a primary domain, meaning if you're not using a domain that you want to use from the get-go, this is an extra step. So I'm going to use this domain that I own just for demo purposes. I'm just going to type it in here. I'm going to click confirm. Once I do that, I'll get this processing your request screen. It'll take a couple of minutes to complete. And what will happen after this is done is it'll ask me to point my domain to these name servers. Again, every hosting environment is going to let you do that. So for this, so I'm managing this domain in Ionos, different provider. I'm going to use the use custom name servers option. And it's going to warn me. It's going to say, you shouldn't do this. That's fine. So we're going to point this domain to these name servers, and we're going to click save. And usually this takes up to 2 days actually to update. So when you're doing this, just be careful and be ready to wait 2 days. Usually it happens much faster, but the system warns you that it might take more than 2 days, or up to 2 days, I should say. So what this will do is now it'll tell this address to use these name servers in order to look for where the website is hosted. So these servers that we're pointing it to are actually owned by SiteGround, and it'll tell this domain registrar, which is Ionos in my case, to point this particular address to these servers, essentially. So let me show you what that looks like. So once I go into this website, you can see that it's already changed. I'm going to go into Site Tools. So it's changed in the settings for SiteGround, but it doesn't mean that my address is already updated. So because I'm in the process of changing this particular address to the name servers, you can see that all of my options disappeared for now. So let me just refresh and see if they showed up. If not, what I'll do is I'll pause the video. We'll wait. Usually it takes a few minutes for this to update, and then we'll continue on with some of the required changes that you need to make in order to update the URL. So I'll be right back. All right, so some of our settings are back. It's still saying that the domain's not pointed to the site, so it's still giving me a warning, meaning that the name server change that I did on the Ionos side hasn't propagated yet. So again, this might take up to 2 days, but usually, like I said, it's fairly quick. That doesn't stop us from going through some of the other important portions here of the backend hosting. So what'll happen now is that our site is not going to be accessible for the time being. So if you remember, we were using this temporary URL. If I try to refresh that, it'll give me an error. So this is a certificate error, but I believe if I try to go into the site, it'll give me an error because the URL hasn't propagated yet. So there's nothing to, it's saying not found. So when we try to access this particular URL, we can see that it's still pointed to the wrong place. It's pointing to my main website, so it's not active yet. And we can tell by this message that we're getting that the domain hasn't propagated yet. So there's a few things to do before that happens. The other thing I wanted to show as well is on your hosting account where your actual domain is hosted. You'll see that, for example, you might see the changes. This also sometimes takes a little bit of time to update on the domain registrar side, the name servers, but you can see the name servers are actually pointed to SiteGround, which is good. And the other message that you'll see if you try to edit your DNS settings, it'll say that your DNS settings are inactive. That's because you pointed your name servers somewhere else. So you're basically telling this domain to look somewhere else for DNS settings. And this is common and this is expected. Like I said earlier, another option could have been to point the A record, this IP directly to the server. So I believe it's this IP, or actually it's this IP. We could have done that as well. But this gives you a little bit more flexibility to manage, for example, your domain settings in SiteGround versus managing them in Ionos. So there's more to it than this. This is a fairly complicated topic. I try to summarize it as best as I can. But essentially, those are your three options. You have an option of pointing your name servers. You have an option of pointing your A record to the IP where your website is hosted. And you have an option of hooking up a domain that you own through SiteGround or through another provider. So those are your three options. What I do is I point my domains using the name server option. It is a little bit more complicated, but it gives you a little bit more control as well over some of the settings that I'll show you in a second. So while that's updating, so what's happening now is actually the cool thing about this SiteGround method of you doing it this way is SiteGround's going to update your entire database and your website with that new URL. So if you had any pictures that were pointing to the old temporary address or anything like that, any assets, they'll automatically be switched over and updated to the new URL, which is really good and helpful. So other than that, some of the, I went through most of the options here when I was doing my overview of the hosting, but some of the things that you'll frequently access is going to be either the file manager, depending on how you access your website, or FTP method. So you can either connect through FTP or you can view your files through here. You can even make quick edits to your files directly from here. So for example, if I wanted to edit WP config, I could just edit it straight through here, make any changes to this file, save it, and that's it. Off I go. So it's an easy way to edit files if you need to edit them from this interface. Of course, you can also go the FTP account route. I haven't created any, but you can go through FTP and hook up to your data to your files and modify them. Again, remember for WordPress, it's a little bit more complicated. You can't just make changes to your files locally. If you were to download all the files locally to your machine and make some changes to them, upload them to the server, it wouldn't work necessarily, depending on what you're doing, because the database also writes and makes changes to the database in order to be able to make changes to your website, to your WordPress website. So that's a little bit of a difference between having a static HTML, CSS website and having a WordPress website. So that's one option you'll frequently use and that you need to get familiar with. The other one is the backups. So when I showed this last time, we just created this environment, so there weren't any backups available. I waited a couple of days between recording some of the previous modules and this one, just because I wanted to show this option in a little bit more detail. So the backups are going to be automatic. So I can't see them now. It's still updating here at my website, but they are here and they are available. What will happen is SiteGround will take an automatic backup every day, meaning, you know, if something goes wrong or if you change something by accident or, you know, make a mistake or whatever, you'll be able to restore the website using this method. What I also urge people to do, because again, it's a bit complicated with WordPress, there's a lot of components involved. If you're making any changes that are going to be a little bit tricky, you know, create a staging environment and do them in there, or you can create a backup here and a manual backup, and then you can restore it if anything goes wrong. So this is great if you have, for example, changes that you're making in between backups, those daily backups that maybe you want to restore quickly or whatever. So this is another area here that you should get familiar with if you're using SiteGround. Some vendors, hosting providers, I should say, don't offer automatic backups. So then you need a third-party solution like a plugin or something. One of the reasons I like SiteGround is because they have these automatic backups. In Ionos, for example, that I was showing earlier, they don't offer automatic backups, for example, so you have to do something else. The other portion that you should be familiar with is creating SSLs. So if you remember, we created an SSL for the temporary domain. However, now we've made changes in order to use this domain that we want to use for a project. So we have to recreate the SSL, and we do this the same way. Again, let's encrypt, and we click get. I'm not going to do that yet because it's not going to work because my address hasn't propagated yet. So you're going to have to wait for the address to propagate, and then you're going to have to click and create an SSL again. So I'll do that. I'm not going to, it'll take a little while for this to propagate. So I just wanted to, in this module, go through some of the main components as well so that you can familiarize yourself with these on your own. Again, backups, very important portion here. Get familiar with them. I can't see them now because again, it's still propagating and changing, but you'll have options here to restore either the database or restore files or restore everything. Usually what you do is you restore everything, and that will overwrite your database with the backup that it created and also your files with that backup version that you had. One of the one of the things, one of the gotchas with SiteGround is what it does with the restore. If you are doing a restore, is it's not going to delete your files and then copy them into your folders here. What it'll do instead, it's going to actually write any files that you have, write any files that are in the backup on top of every file that you already have in your environment. So what I usually suggest here is that just delete, before restoring a backup, if you are restoring a backup, delete your public HTML folder and then restore the backup. It sounds a little tricky and risky, but trust me, it works. You can play around with it before you actually, before you actually go live, play around with it and get familiar with it. But that's the way I do it in SiteGround. So it's just a little gotcha if you are using SiteGround. So yeah, so backups, again, very important. SSL manager, very important. Get familiar with that. Speed caching. I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail towards the end. There is a dedicated module for caching and site optimization. So I'll go through these in a little bit more detail then, and kind of walk through what you want to do. SiteGround does offer a little bit of some extra features that can be used to speed up your website. Another really useful feature here is staging. So staging is where you would create your staging environment for the website. So it'll create create a complete copy of the website, and it'll give it a new URL. So it'll be staging.cliodatasolutions.ca, which you can access and make changes and test and do whatever without impacting your live site. So this is, again, this is really a cool feature. You can also, once you're ready to push that staging copy, you can take that staging copy and push it and replace your live copy of your website. So it's a really good way to roll out new features or make changes to your website. So that's a really important function that I think you should get familiar with. Search and replace is also really cool. So what it'll do is, so this is happening automatically now, actually, because I'm changing the URL. So it'll look for that old string that I had, this URL. It'll look for it everywhere in the database files and whatever, and it'll replace it in your website. And it's really handy. It's a really handy feature. It's like doing a search and replace on your whole website. So you know, for example, let's say you moved your all your media over to a new folder or something like that, and you want to update all your media URLs to the new location. You can do that here. You can put in an old URL and new URL and search and replace, and just replace everything in the system, which is really useful. So there are plugins for that for WordPress as well, but this is cool to have included in the hosting environment. Another cool thing is, emails are included as well. So you could create emails for this cliodatasolutions.ca account, for example. I can create a new email address here. This is also included for free. So it's awesome and really handy. Again, I'm not going to do that for this. It's super simple to set up and get going, but it's a common feature. So the clients usually ask for, when you're setting up your own domain and you want professional looking emails with your own domain. So the reason why we're able, so one thing I want to clarify, if you are creating email accounts, you can only do that if you're using the name server route. So meaning you're pointing your name servers to this account, you can create email accounts. If you're just pointing your A record, like I said earlier, to the server, you won't be able to use the email functionality. You'll have to do it somewhere else. Also, if you're using a domain name that you already own through SiteGround, and you hook it up to your website, just like I did here, you can also use the email functionality. So that's the only gotcha here. And for using emails. Another cool feature here is the DNS zone editor. So sometimes what you'll need to do is you're going to need to make some record changes to your domain. These are all default here. Because you pointed the name servers over to this account, you're able to make these changes. So remember when I showed you earlier here that we have DNS entries here and they're kind of grayed out. It's saying, they're inactive because you're using a custom name server, meaning you've pointed everything over to SiteGround. So now, because you did that, now you can make changes here and update any of the records, any of the DNS records in here. So this is handy as well, DNS zone editor. Sometimes you'll need to make changes and it's handy. Out of the box, it works. So you don't have to touch anything here. You don't have to modify anything. But if you do, I would say get familiar with that as well. And you can change any of the settings in the DNS zone editor. So that's another important one that I would focus on. The last but not least, and this totally depends on your comfort level, and it's not definitely not something that you'll need to touch frequently with WordPress. Again, depending on what you're working with and what kind of goals you have and what you're trying to accomplish with WordPress. But there are certain PHP variables that you can set up. So which PHP version you're using, remember, WordPress is going to use PHP as well. That's another component. So you can change your PHP versions in here. They'll also be automatically managed by SiteGround, and you can also manage your PHP variables. Again, you're going to do this often, but if you do, this is where you would find them, and this is where you would modify them as well. So those are kind of some of the most important areas of the backend sort of access. Let me just go through this and make sure I didn't forget anything. And then, yeah, and again, you can certainly explore these on your own. I'm just going through some of the most commonly used ones and explaining them. The other, I did forget something, and it's important. It's the database access. So let's say you need to make some changes to the database. Again, you don't have to do this straight through the database itself, but sometimes, for troubleshooting, it's handy to know how to access this and how to make changes. So like I said, WordPress is going to use the database. It's going to write settings and data to the database as well. So it's handy to know, how to access this. So what you do here is here you can manage the database. So you can see we have this database created that was created when we actually created the website. And what we want to do next is we're going to go and so you have some tabs here. Again, I wouldn't worry about them. Again, this is a little bit more advanced. So you could create, for example, multiple databases for different functionality within your application, or you can create multiple sites using, different databases. You can create something that's called multi-site environments for WordPress. Again, more advanced topics, and this is where you might need to access the database, database information, user information, and so forth. If you want to just take a look at the database and see how some of the records and change some records and see how it's structured, you would do that using phpMyAdmin. I'm not sure this will work right now because our domain is propagating, but I can click it and see. It looks like it's actually using a SiteGround account, so it looks like it'll work fine. So in phpAdmin, you'll be able to see all of your tables, records, and all of the settings are written in this database. You can see some things like our website name and tagline and stuff like that. So definitely useful to get familiar with. But again, if you're a beginner, I wouldn't recommend playing around with the database too much, but just it's handy to know where it is and how to access it through SiteGround. So that's another important area. So I don't want to overwhelm people by introducing SQL at this point, but if you do need to access it, this is where it is. And it's another important feature of the website. So that's it for this module. Those are the options that I wanted to show. Again, they're going to be very similar for other hosting environments as well. The concepts are the same. It just might look a little bit differently, and it might the interface might be different. But in terms of the features, they're going to be called the same thing, and you're going to be able to edit them with any good hosting environment. They're going to be called the same. It's going to be the same module, same functionality, and everything else, but the look and feel might be a little bit different. So hopefully that helps you in understanding what some of these backend components are that are required for WordPress. Let's just recap real quick. So topic 3 was getting familiar with backups and restores. So again, setting up staging environments. I showed where that is. So definitely do play around with that and get familiar with that, because if you do experience any issues, it's really easy to restore a backup and just kind of keep going as you were earlier. So it's a very important and one of the most important features when you're working with WordPress databases and applications. Installing an SSL certificate and enabling caching. Again, I showed where that is. I showed that in one of the previous modules as well. So again, install an SSL certificate, force SSL, meaning, force all your traffic to go through that secure route. That's also important. And it's also something that you want to play around with and get familiar with, because it's an important feature as well. Enable caching, so it's enabled by default. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in the future modules in terms of how to tune this and how to optimize caching for your website, but I showed where it is, and again, it's another important component. And learn how to use and modify the backend components like PHP version and making changes to the database. That's another very important component of this. So those are that's it for topic 3. So we'll keep going and cover some more WordPress stuff in the next topics. Thank you.